Hi guys, I'm going to start the lesson by looking at a satirist known as Tom Lehrer. So Tom Lehrer is still around, but he's long since retired from the 1970s onwards. He wrote songs making fun of things, which is what a satirical song would be about. So pause the video and have a listen to this song. We will all go together when we go. So we've got one part from the song here. We're going to come back to this song towards the end of the lesson. It's talking about the idea of universal bereavement, literally every single person dying. And obviously this is really sarcastic. It's a very, very uplifting song about a very depressing thing. This is an example of the type of satire that people would make to kind of cope with the tensions of the Cold War. This lesson we're going to be looking at how tensions increase between 1949 and 1955. You'll notice in the success criteria we've got three different coloured terms. Hopefully you already know what an arms race is based off your Year 9 work on reasons for World War I. But we're going to look at the Cold War's arms race, and we're going to look at two different alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. We're going to start off with the arms race. Using pages 32 to 33 in your textbook, can you write down at least 5 bullet points explaining the arms race within the context of the Cold War? We've got a really basic cartoon to demonstrate what an arms race is. The basic idea of an arms race is each side competing to have better arms or better weapons or better military specs. So go through page 32 and 33, make sure you've got at least one key statistic or fact that you could do in the exam. In the next slide, we're going to look at some key Soviet arms race advancements. Now you might remember World War II ended with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by America. The thing that was so terrifying about this is that these were the only time nuclear weapons have been used on an enemy. Many have been tested since then, but America remains the only country to actually use a nuclear weapon against its enemy. From 1949, however, the Soviet Union gained the ability to do that as well. So between 1945 and 1949, America, if it had wanted to, could have used nuclear weapons and maybe ended the Cold War before it really truly began. Of course, that would have been an absolutely horrendous thing. America would be vilified as the next Adolf Hitler, but that is a power that they had. From 1949 onwards, they do not have that power, or at least they don't have the sole power to do that. We'll look at what that means in a slide or so. In 1953, Stalin dies and Nikita Khrushchev kind of becomes the next leader. We'll look at in another lesson there's actually a guy in between Stalin and Khrushchev called Malenkov, but he doesn't do anything of note for the Cold War, so we'll just pretend that he doesn't exist. He makes the decision to continue research into nuclear weaponry, and even by this point they've moved on from atomic bombs into H-bombs, which are even more powerful. A few years later, the Soviet Union will launch its first ICBM, or Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. So missile we can all understand, big rocket, ballistic means explosive, and intercontinental means it can travel so far it can go from one continent to another. Now, in 1957, neither side has the ability to launch missiles at the other country from their own country, but certainly they have the ability to launch missiles from their allies into the other country. And in 1961, you have the most powerful bomb which is ever created and tested, the Tsar bomber or King bomb. Now, there's going to be another clip in the description which you guys can pause this video and look at. It gives you an idea of how powerful modern nuclear weapons are compared to the two nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So if you like, pause the video and have a quick look at that to get a sense of what both sides are working with the Cold War and what they might have today. Now we've got a key term which is going to be really crucial for the Cuban Missiles Crisis of 1962. It's called Mutually Assured Destruction, and it's shortened to MAD. It's the kind of acronym where people have come up with the term just because the word sounds really cool. So you talk about MAD theory. Mutually Assured Destruction has loads of complicated words. Hopefully I don't need to define what destruction is. Assured means promise. and mutually means both sides are doing it. So if we come to a mutual understanding, we both understand each other. In mutually assured destruction, it's the idea that neither side will launch their nuclear weapons, because if they do, the other side will launch their nuclear weapons. So neither side has the ability to stop the enemy's nuclear weapons. This is to deter or prevent nuclear weapons from ever being used, because one side knows that they will be wiped out as well. As long as both superpowers have dozens, if not hundreds, of nuclear weapons, they are safe from having nuclear weapons used against them. Now, if you're looking at this thinking this sounds absolutely crazy, that's entirely why they called it mad. It is a mad theory, and it kind of works. But as we look at in the Cuban Missiles Crisis in about 5 or 6 lessons from now, the major problem with this is that if their tensions are so high, there is a very real danger that things can get lost in translation, one leader can lose his cool, press that button, and he literally blows up the entire world in a fireball. We've got 2 more links in the video description. One of them is a bit of US propaganda. This is generally shown across schools or in TV programs or in films across America in the 1960s. It's called Bert the Turtle. It's an instructional video from the US government showing people how they can protect themselves against a nuclear explosion. So I thoroughly recommend you pause this video and have a look at it, because it really is quite remarkable. So if you've seen the video, they are genuinely recommending school children or any other person to get under a table in the event of a nuclear explosion. Your grandparents might remember being taught this as well in Britain or other countries. If you look at the other video, you can see why that sort of recommendation is completely useless. These are footages, or this is footage from one of the earliest nuclear bomb testing, so in the 1940s. It's not really accounting for how much more powerful they became in the 1950s and 60s. But even a few miles away from the detonation site of a nuclear bomb, whole buildings can be demolished. Your tiny, pathetic little school table is not going to protect you. But this is a clear lie told by Britain and by America and by pretty much any other country in the Cold War, trying to reassure their citizens that they can protect themselves in the event of a nuclear bomb. Complete nonsense, wouldn't work. And in any case, if you're that close to be blown up or your building blown up, you'll probably die from lethal radiation within a couple of days or weeks. So moving on to a slightly less cheerful subject, or maybe more cheerful. Maybe we won't get blown up because of NATO. We've looked at the arms race. Now we need to look at these 2 great alliances. It's a similar map to the first lesson, but this one is focused purely on the alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So looking at this map, the darkest blue countries are the ones that started in NATO, and any other shade of blue later joined NATO. And the same thing for the Warsaw Pact. You've got all these dark red countries in Eastern Europe. The one addition later is East Germany, that kind of pinky country in the middle of Europe. So we're going to look at the causes, events and results of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So please make sure you're writing these details down in your notes. So we said last lesson that one consequence of the Berlin blockade and airlift is that the Western countries, Britain and America specifically, recognised that they needed to protect West Germany and West Berlin at all costs. It had been shown that Stalin was prepared to act incredibly aggressively to spread communism, so Truman's doctrine was being tested to its very limit. As a result, America, Canada and 10 democracies in Europe, including Britain, formed a defensive military alliance. So military in the sense of a war, alliance in the sense of a team, and it's defensive in the sense that if any one of those countries is attacked, all countries in that alliance must help. America would then start stationing its own troops and missiles inside NATO countries. So obviously America already had American soldiers in West Germany, or the areas of West Germany that it controlled. But once other countries like Britain or France or Italy are in NATO, there's a greater reason for America to protect them. And it's a direct challenge to the Soviet Union saying, if you invade, let's say, Italy, you will have to kill American soldiers. In other words, the chances of America responding are now 100%. If there were no American soldiers in Italy, there's a chance America would back down. But Truman and his successors will deliberately make sure that they are provoked into action by keeping American soldiers in any NATO country. They'll also have the opportunity to put their own missiles in those countries as well. And there we have the ability for American missiles to blow up the Soviet Union. Results are incredibly predictable. This would massively worsen the relationship between the USSR and the West. Why wouldn't it? Stalin viewed this as an aggressive alliance rather than a defensive alliance. Strictly speaking, it is only defensive. In other words, if America declared war on the Soviet Union, any other NATO country wouldn't have to get involved. They'd only have to get involved if one of those countries was invaded. But in reality, the chances of most, if not all, NATO countries attacking the Soviet Union if America declared war were pretty high, because they knew that if they didn't declare war on the Soviet Union and then were later attacked, America's chances of helping them would be massively reduced. Now, going on to the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw, if you're not sure, is the capital of Poland. This is where this pact was signed. Pact is a fancy word for agreement or alliance. So you've got the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the Warsaw Pact. Now, the Warsaw Pact isn't set up in the years after the Berlin blockade and airlift. Even though Stalin is incensed, he is furious at NATO, he doesn't set up his own version. Part of the reason is Stalin just doesn't think that he needs it. He is the man of steel. He is the man who conquered the Nazis. He's the man who took over Eastern Europe. He's very sure in his abilities to keep control of Eastern Europe. However, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, is less sure of that. The trigger is when West Germany officially joins NATO. This makes Khrushchev realise that he needs to set up his own similar organisation to protect East Germany and other Eastern European countries. So, as a result, 7 countries behind the Iron Curtain are forced into a military alliance with the USSR. Now, you notice that I've used the word forced. Loads of countries will be applying to join NATO. Even today, people are trying to join NATO. But the Warsaw Pact is not a choice, and it will become a flare point. It will become a reason for tension between the Soviet Union and Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Now, just a small point about that map on the bottom right. You'll notice that in the centre of Europe, there's loads of countries which are neither blue nor pink. Right in the middle, above Italy, you've got Switzerland, famously neutral in World War I, World War II, and in the Cold War. They all stay out of all of these conflicts because they know that position between powerful countries like France, Germany, or I guess the Soviet Union, they would easily be overwhelmed. But also, because they're an incredibly mountainous country, they're actually very easy to defend themselves compared to other countries. So they don't want to provoke other countries into attacking them, but they also know that they'd have a fairly good chance of defending themselves in a conventional, in other words, non-nuclear war. To the east of Switzerland is Austria, and Austria is officially not allowed to join NATO because it had been such a key supporter of Germany in World War II, even though he had been taken over before World War II. One agreement which is made between the superpowers is that Austria will not join NATO because that would be violating neutrality. In other words, it would be Austria taking a side. So Austria will be democratic, it will be capitalist, but it will never be officially a member of NATO, and it still isn't a member of NATO today. We've got the green splodge of Yugoslavia. We've talked about Marshal Tito having a split with Stalin and refusing to follow the Soviet Union's directions. And we've also got, underneath Yugoslavia, a slightly orangey pinky country of Albania. Albania splits away from the Soviet Union, so they will sometimes listen to them, but they'll sometimes be further away as well. They're kind of protected because they're surrounded by either capitalist countries like Greece or a powerful non-Stalinist country, Yugoslavia. But other than those exceptions, all of Central Europe is divided into either NATO or Warsaw Pact countries. Again, results of the Warsaw Pact are completely predictable. It's the reverse of the results for NATO. This deeply worsens the relationship between the USSR and the West view this as an aggressive alliance. Again, all true, just like it's all true for the other side. Now, we need to have a look at a hard bit of exam practice. We've looked at a question 1, explain 2 consequences of something. Question 3 starts out fairly similarly, but it ends up being much more difficult, even though it's worth the same amount of marks. So question 3 will always say something like, explain the importance of something for something. Now, we're going to start out with probably the easiest type of question here, with the easiest tail. So we've got explain the importance of NATO and the Warsaw Pact for the development of the Cold War. If you ever get a choice of the question 3, and you do get a choice of question 3 in the exam, you get 3 choices and you must pick 2, you always want to try and go for development of the Cold War because it's the broadest tail to a question. You could get a more specific type of question saying something like, explain the importance of NATO and the Warsaw Pact for the future of Germany. In other words, everything in your answer would have to relate to what's happening to Germany across the Cold War. But this phrase here, development of the Cold War, basically means how did NATO and the Warsaw Pact affect anything in the Cold War after the creation of those 2 alliances? So you need to think about why these alliances were important, and you should come up with 2 reasons to try and get full marks. The best answers are going to group them thematically. Now we've got loads of different examples here. We've got political and economic. You might instantly start thinking about social, but I generally advise against a social paragraph for the Cold War because the Cold War is just not very focused on social impacts. So you've got political, economic, military, a change in leadership, a rise in tensions, a change in ideology. There's loads of different ones that you can use depending on the question you get, but the first 3 are the ones which you're probably going to rely on: politics, economy, and military. In each of those 2 paragraphs, you're going to be doing a PE paragraph, just like you would in question 1, but it's going to be beefier. This is a bigger and harder question to do, even though they are worth the same amount of marks. It's a very odd quirk of the exam mark scheme. Obviously, you want to use your best points, and the way you're going to do that is by filling it with precise factual detail. So that's why every single lesson we've always been trying to make sure you get at least 1 or 2 bits of precise factual detail, so you're covering your bases no matter what the exam board asks you. Obviously, repeat that for a second example. So you're using the phrasing of the question at the start and at the end. It seems really stupid to repeat yourself towards the end of each paragraph, but because you've got that tail, the idea you've got to focus on development of the Cold War, if you're not using the phrasing of the question again, you're probably going to end up missing the point of the question. Therefore, a 6-mark question might end up getting more like a 4-mark question. So we've got an example which you are more than welcome to use. NATO and the Warsaw Pact were important for the development of the Cold War because of their political impact or their political result. NATO was created as a direct result of the Berlin blockade from 1948 to 49. Similarly, the Warsaw Pact was created by Khrushchev due to West Germany joining NATO. Each of these alliances promised to help each of their members if they were attacked. Both groups were only made up of capitalists or communists, making the political divide between them even stronger. This was important for the development of the Cold War because it increased both superpowers' distrust of the other side and led to further crises such as the Warsaw Pact's invasion of Hungary in 1956. Now, that answer there is much more difficult to do in time conditions than a question 1. If you were to do that quality paragraph again for, let's say, military or economic, you're definitely looking at a 6-mark out of 8, probably a 7-mark out of 8. The way you're going to guarantee yourself full marks is by adding more precise factual detail. So you'll notice I didn't mention which countries or how many countries are in each of them. You wouldn't have to list all of them, but give a few examples. You haven't said, for example, that NATO was formed in response to Stalin's aggression. In terms of the last bit, talking about Warsaw Pact's invasion of Hungary in 1956, obviously we haven't actually taught you that yet. It's one of the difficult parts about teaching this course and doing exam practice at the same time. Because we teach it chronologically, it wouldn't make sense to do it any other way, but it means that you're missing key points from the future that you don't know about yet. So if you don't get the mark that you particularly want in this exam practice question when you submit it to your teachers, I definitely recommend going back and redoing it in a month or two and thinking, now that I know what happens in the next few decades, can I get a better answer? So please make sure that you're submitting this question to your teacher. Again, feel free to use this paragraph, but if you want to challenge yourself, try and rewrite it yourself. I'd strongly recommend a second paragraph would either be economic or military. In a military paragraph, you can also add in details about the arms race, things about the atomic bomb or the H-bomb, because all of this is meaning that those nuclear weapons and that mad theory is applying to not just America and the Soviet Union, but all of their allies as well. So if we go back to Tom Lehrer's song, if you want to pause the video and go back to that, feel free. We've got a slightly different quote here from the song here. The idea of mad is supposed to make the world safer by making the world more dangerous. So neither side will use nuclear weapons because the other side has nuclear weapons. But combined with the Warsaw Pact and NATO, all they've done is spread the risk or spread the danger of millions of people being wiped out. Now you might think to yourself, well, that's fine. I'll have just moved to Africa or I'll have just moved to Australia during the Cold War. That way I'd be safe because they're not involved in those alliances. But the problem with so many nuclear weapons going off is that it would literally create what's called a nuclear winter. In other words, it would create so much pollution or so much smog or so much cooling of the world's atmosphere, it would likely lead to a nuclear winter where crops fail on a mass level and millions, if not billions of people would starve to death. So with that cheerful note in mind, can you try and make sure you've got a direct answer to the lesson question by picking a couple of these points? If you want to stretch and challenge yourself, think about how far are nuclear weapons making NATO and the Warsaw Pact obsolete, in other words, unnecessary? If you think about the causes of World War I, the arms race and the alliance system were major causes of that. Remember, the alliance system of the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, the basic idea was neither side would want war because each side had so many allies. But now, in the 1950s, you've got these two massive power blocks of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Only a couple of countries will have nuclear weapons at that point, but it's enough to mean that all of those countries might get wiped off the face of the earth. So, does it make sense to have military alliances in the age of nuclear weapons? And that's something for the Cold War and maybe even for today. NATO still exists. It still is kind of the we hate Russia club. Obviously Russia's not allowed in it, but many former Soviet Union countries or Eastern European countries are either in NATO or wanting to join NATO. The Warsaw Pact is dissolved in 1991. The Soviet Union realizes by 1991 it can no longer force Eastern European countries to remain in it, and because they want to leave, the Warsaw Pact is dissolved. So that's been our lesson on how did tensions increase from 1949 to 1955. If you think we've now done over 10 years of the Cold War course, so we're running through the content in an incredibly short period of time. Make sure you go back over your notes. We're coming close to the end of topic 1, and it'd be a really good idea to make sure that your topic 1 revision notes are really, really clear. On Schoology, there'll be a set of the flashcards which we've been handing out for the medicine and Elizabeth courses. We expect those to be filled into a good level. So make sure a good level is whatever you want it to be. Obviously, it depends on what sort of grade you're wanting to get at the end of year 11.